Welcome to the Forward Miami Show. I am your host, Damian Pardo, and Forward Miami is a local nonprofit that works with diversity and inclusion. We love to say that we are the salad bowl that holds Miami's salad of diversity. My guest with me this week, super excited, is Vanessa Garcia. Vanessa is a playwright, has done a lot of amazing things, written a lot of amazing articles. If you've never heard of her, she did the play Amparo, which was a local success here in Miami-Dade County. And with that, I introduce you to Vanessa Garcia.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Hey, Vanessa, how are you today?
I'm good. I'm on the road, so I'm outside at a Starbucks, but it's nice and sunny, so we're all good.
That's great. Listen, one of the reasons I was dying to have you on this show was to talk a little bit about, well, first of all, your background, where you come from, and your perspectives as a Cuban American just in this community. Maybe we could start with that.
Sure. So I'm the daughter of two Cuban refugees and granddaughter of Cuban refugees. So we're Cuban all around. My grandfather was originally from Spain. But I come from a long family of what I call, freedom fighters, in the sense that I had a grandfather who was a political prisoner in Cuba for 15 years, an uncle who was a political prisoner for 9 years. And, since I was born, the story of Cuba has been my story. So I very much consider myself an ABC, an American-born Cuban, born on, in Miami Beach. But I didn't speak English until I went to school. Spanish was what was spoken in my house, and Cuban was what was spoken in my house. So that story is very much a part of me. That's my background.
So let me ask you something. I know in Miami-Dade County, it can be tough sometimes being Cuban American because a lot of people just don't understand, and the language barrier and everything else. How do you find it living here, being a writer, which is something that's all about communicating? How do you find it difficult or not difficult, or how do you find success?
So I think that one of the big things is that it's a complicated story, and we in Miami-Dade County have a lot of Cubans, right? So part of us think, a lot of us think that the world knows the story that we know, right? And it's not actually that way. And so part of my mission is to realize that what we see very up close, and what we sometimes have, Cuba fatigue on, which is like we're talking about it so much, actually is very closed off to the world. And we have to keep talking about it so that the world understands the truth of what's happening in Cuba and with Miami Cubans and with Miami-Dade County. So I think that's one of the biggest things, and just continuing to tell the story, because with every continuation of the story, there's a sort of peeling back. The other challenge that I have come across is that, sometimes people see Cuban Americans as these crazy Cubans that are screaming in Versailles. That's what comes across, in the media, both here and abroad. And so, sort of peeling back the layers of that and just saying, well, let's see why they're screaming. Let's now step back a second and see, okay, what are the facts that are leading to this moment, and what are they trying to say? Because behind every attempt to raise your voice, there is a desire to be heard, right? And so what is that thing that we're trying to say?
Absolutely. Do you find that in the media there's an anti-Cuban bias?
I think there is, and I don't think that is inconsequential. I mean, I think there was a very pointed attempt by the Cuban regime in the island to tarnish the reputation of Cubans over and over again outside of Cuba, in order so that there would be one story and one narrative coming out of the Cuban regime. So, for example, there were a lot of people that were in Miami in the 90s it's kind of even crazy to say, but they were essentially, undercover and spies and trying to tarnish the reputation of, and this is information that comes from scholars and people that have this. So this is actually pretty factual. Tarnish the reputation of Cuban Americans. Then there's the Mariel Boatlift, which that was part of breaking what was the golden immigrant that the Cuban was, in the 60s. They came here, they worked hard, they rose up. Still to this day, I mean, we're the heads, like in Miami. Latins have not been the people sweeping floors. They are everywhere. You know what I mean? Including in government and everywhere, at the top of corporations. And so the attempt that Fidel Castro had to say, okay, well, all of these people on the island want to get out. Let's open up the escape valve and let them out during the Mariel Boatlift, for example. Well, with those people came people he didn't want on the island anymore, that he considered undesirables, right? Along with the Gusanos and the Cuban Americans, which were prisoners and people who were in insane asylums, and other people which he considered undesirable, which are not, which are,
Well,
the LGBTQ
a lot of
community.
yeah, and a lot of LGBTQ people, they were certainly in that group as well.
For sure. For sure. And those were magnificent people, among them people like Reinaldo Arenas, but with that push came that group of people, and the narrative was, what became the Scarface narrative, right? Like, that is what a Cuban American is. And then we got even more diluted with Elian, because the narrative coming out of Cuba was these crazy Cubans want to take our child, which was a lot more complicated than that. So that's the layers of, it's not something that just happened or that I don't think, is one-sided. So it has many layers to that.
It sure does. You said a couple of things that kind of trigger me. The whole thing about spies. I mean,
Yeah.
If you and I talk about it and we understand it, like, if we're talking anywhere else, people think we're nuts.
Of course.
No one can understand. I mean, they might get the consequences that the Russians did something, but they don't understand that part of that intelligence network is to actually be here, be present, and actively work against any other narrative that doesn't fit the regime.
That's correct. So what happened, and this is now because the Stasi regime, like, we're talking now like Soviet, because the Soviets trained essentially the Cubans. This is not something that is ahistorical. This is incredibly historical. The Soviets were part of Cuba. They trained the Cuban in all of their intelligence. And this is not something I'm saying. You could go to the Stasi Museum in Berlin and look at the archives, and the information is there. And also, if you even just go to the Stasi Museum and see their exhibits, you can see that the exact levels of surveillance and, for example, the communities of people, of spies within the island, right? Like that are the tattletales of everyone within the community, right? So that is a system that was created and that Cuba still has alive and running. And so we all seem crazy to the world, but when you actually look at the facts and look at the archives, it's actually pretty scary. And it is very much like you're saying. It's the creation of one narrative led by the Cuban regime that people are buying all around, and then it's our responsibility to say, wait, let's look at all the facts, right? So let's look at the facts and say, okay, here's this part of the story, peel back the layers, and here's this other part of the story, here's this other part of the story. So we're not looking at it from one perspective.
Yeah, I want to use Elian a little bit as an example of that, because I remember myself and two other Cuban Americans, all of us happen to be gay. We're in DC working on a project when that story broke. And we're all progressives. At least that's what we especially were at that time. Yeah. And we felt such abandonment from our community, from the LGBTQ community, from the progressive community, from what was a more liberal community, that it was shocking. I mean, I think we were all a little bit PTSD'd about the whole thing, because the way media was covering it was like, here are these weird grandmothers talking about private parts, and then here are these burning tires on 8th Street with these weirdo, crazy Cuban people. And then, in our mind, we're like, but wait a minute, there's a legitimate piece of that story where this family just wants this case to be heard in family court, which determines what's in the best interest of the child. That shouldn't be something that, becomes an international incident. Correct. Bottom line, everybody should have agreed what's in the best interest of the child. And I wanted to pick your brain, your perceptions around that time period.
Yeah, I was in college at the time. And so I'm an independent and have always voted blue. So I'm like you, I'm progressive. That's most of my closest friends. And definitely when I was at college, the people who I was around were all very progressive as well. And so it was disturbing that they couldn't see this side of the story, especially for people that are saying, I always want to understand your perspective, right? But there wasn't an understanding of the perspective and an allowance of saying what it was, which was essentially that this mother had risked her life to leave Cuba, and you cannot look at that from an American perspective. You cannot, and by American I mean United States, not the greater Americas. I'm talking about, you cannot look about this from a United States perspective, because then what you're looking at is what they continually said was a custody case, which it is not. I mean, it was something else. It was bigger than just the United States argument between a mother and father who are going to get divorced, right? This is not what that was. And the only way to understand that is to understand that in 1994, like in the 90s, there was the Maleconazo. There were people trying to leave Cuba, protesting in the streets, Cuba sí, Castro no. There was all of this protest of people needing and wanting to get out. Arguably among those, Elian's dad, in some records, you know what I mean? Not as a protester, I don't have that information, but that there were conversations that, he wanted to leave the island, right? So there's all this inside information that the family had that then is blocked off, because what you're seeing when Elian's father comes on TV is something that is allowed by the Cuban regime and the Cuban state, which is a dictatorship. So then how do you deal with that in a way that's very, very, very different than what you assume from our democratic standpoint and point of view? You have to look from the other side. The mother lost her life trying to give her son another. As a mother, when I think about that, I get all the goosebumps, and I think of the horror that ensued, and the big tangle of information, and people who were not adequately informed giving opinions on national news over and over again and calling Cuban terrorists. To this day, I wrote an article about Elian for the anniversary, and I got emails saying, yeah, well, the Cubans were all terrorists and they were all well, that is incredibly difficult to hear and pretty ignorant, so.
Oh, I bet. I know for me, when I read about the visas that the father had applied for, the U.S. was very complicit in hiding that information. The U.S. insisted that he had never applied for, but years later, it actually came out that he had applied several times trying to get out of the island. As you were saying, those are facts, and those are facts that were very important. And part of me wonders, why do you think the U.S. is so complicit with trying to engage Cuba?
I think, I think part of it is there is a lot. It goes back to our initial point that the narrative has been directed by one party, which is in that instance coming from Cuba. And it's very difficult to get out of our mindset when we're, for example, like left-leaning liberals, to then not equate the good with a little left-leaning, whereas then we say, okay, wait, hang on, because this goes full circle, and when you go too much to the left, you have tyranny, right? Like absolute tyranny, which is what happens over there.
The same as far right.
Exactly. It's all a circle, they meet there. And I think what happens with people who are well-intentioned and have good intentions is that they're not seeing outside of their perspective, that you are looking from, again, a democratic standpoint in which a little left, a little right is a very different thing than tyranny, right? And that the image of Castro was cast by an American journalist. It was, Matthews in the New York Times who unveiled this like big, beautiful, patriot that's going to save Cuba and give them democracy back against Batista, which of course didn't end up being the truth of what happened. And there were not a huge amount of guerrillas in the Sierra Maestra at that point. There were like very few of them. So it was this playing of the Cuban government from the beginning with the media and what America was seeing, because what was happening in America at the time, it was the 60s and the hippies, and we were leaning into what was about to become a revolution on our end, but that's a very different kind of revolution, right? So all that gets kind of like this, and you have to say, okay, take away the strands and let's look at it really from what it is instead of what I think it is,
And one of the things I think about a lot is how this issue, meaning Cuba, and the way Cubans and Cuban Americans relate to that separates us in Miami-Dade County on many levels. I think it separates us from the African American community most dramatically than any other community. oftentimes because the African American community travels to Cuba or embraces the idea of the kind of socialism, in quotes, that they're discussing, but also in terms of race and color and how culturally it's different in Hispanic Latino families than maybe it might be here in America. And I know you wrote an article both about how the fist and its imagery divides with Cuban Americans, but also how it feels to be Cuban American and labeled as a person of color. And I thought maybe you could comment a little bit about that and how it might divide us here in Miami.
Yeah, I wish it wouldn't divide us. So the full intention of the piece that I wrote was to unify, in the sense of, in order for us to stand together, we actually have to know each other's full stories, right?
Absolutely.
And so what's the idea of the piece was, I want to hear the full story over here, and I would love to share the full story over here. You know what I mean? So, for example, for a huge part of the BLM movement, or sort of the waves of the movement that were rising in a very positive way last year, the Cuban American community, for the most part, a lot of them felt uncomfortable with some of the messaging behind the movement, which was linked to socialism. Because the founders of the movement spoke about being essentially socialist and trained in the way that, that Castro. They were open about it, right? At the same time, there are people in the Black community that say, stop equating us with communism that is very hurtful to our movement. And the movement has become much, much, much larger than two people who, want to create a socialist revolution, right? So this is it's like all movements, it is much more multiple and includes many, many people. And that's the beauty of it. And in doing that, that means that you don't have to be aligned with every single portion of what that means in order to be able to ally and join. And I think it should be in both, it should go back and forth, right? So one of the reasons that the Cuban Americans felt uncomfortable was that. Another one was the imagery of the fist, which is, at once, it's like, it's an impulse, right? Yes, go, and it also has a big history in communist regimes and revolutions, right? So it has a lot of layers and it has a lot of history. And it's not that it starts there, but it's the trigger for the Cuban American that fist means that. And so we're saying, wait, are you saying, the question that arises inside the Cuban American is, are you saying that in order to solve the problem that was begun with slavery, the horrific problems that we have in race in this country that began there, that we have to become socialist? Because if that's the case, it is not a good idea, because Black people in Cuba are not faring better than here. So that is the conversation that we would like to have, but there was a silencing of that and a saying that is racist, and it isn't. It's a conversation, and I believe that conversation has to happen, and people have to sit at the table and not get up and not just immediately trigger. Because I understand that there's also triggers on the other side, like that's racist, because what you're doing is giving people an excuse to stand behind and say, I'm not going to raise my fist and therefore I won't join Black Lives Matter. So again, it's complex, and to make it simple and to make it something that is a slogan is to play into tyranny of thought. So let's not do that.
I have to say, I went to the very first BLM protest immediately after the murder of George Floyd, and you were able to write so eloquently what I was feeling, and I had never been able to put that into words, but I could not raise my fist and would not raise my fist. And so I think if people like you and I are having these struggles, it definitely merits a back and forth conversation, because there's more here to explore, to bring people to a middle ground.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. Even in the usage of the word equality, that always strikes me, because when I talk about equality, I'm talking about equality of opportunity, right? I don't want equality of people. Like, I don't want people to be the exact same things and to have, I believe in individualism. I believe in meritocracies. I believe in the ability to be able to excel. Yeah. And sometimes that word seems to compromise that. So it's interesting, because the same word can mean many different things to many people in the same place.
Yeah, and I do feel that it is fair and just to be able to say things in your own words, because if not, then again you're playing into like one of the things that, if we are set in this world, which it's so easy to do on social media, like, post, repost, 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 yes, 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 I agree, but you're using the same words over and over and over and over again, and that could very easily turn into, you know, uh, like I said, a tyranny of thought. You're already prepped for it, right? Oh yes, that. Oh yes, that. Oh yes, that. Single. Instead of saying, wait, let me process it. Let me put it in my own words that then I can join with you. Because in my own words, I'm bringing this prism, and therefore I can actually further that relation and that relativity and make it more real and make that bond a true allyship and not one that's superficial and that's just about a repost or a fist.
Yep. What do you think is a good way to go about trying to better that situation?
It's hard because even writing that piece, I knew that I was going to get a lot of negative feedback on it, and it was going to be difficult to have that conversation. But I feel like the thing to do is to have the difficult conversations, like just to keep doing this, because eventually you talk long enough with a person, also one-on-one, even though that seems very hard, one-on-one with people, it does something, because people feel a real deep understanding of what that means and then can pass it on, and you can do the same, and you learn a whole lot in that engagement. I always say, like, dissonance is a good thing. That's what democracy is. We continue in the dissonance because the dissonance leads us, where we need to go. We get all the sides, and it's not until we truly understand them. And that's that's very different than saying, like, yeah, everybody has, freedom of speech, but to really like hear the dissonance and all the pieces of it is important.
And you did get a lot of negative feedback on that piece?
I got very, very positive and very negative feedback. And then I got people afraid of reposting it that then privately messaged me, thank you so much for writing it. And that, it makes me the most scared, actually.
Wow. That's,
yeah.
100%. I agree with you.
Yeah. That to me makes me a little bit, anxious, because I want to ask, why are you afraid? If you agree, why are you afraid to post it? What do you think is going to happen? And I think people are afraid of getting canceled, in this cancel culture. But I think it's of utmost importance that when you are coming from a place of goodness, of justice and freedom and allyship, that you are able to use your voice. I mean, that's why we're here, right?
Exactly. What about, you wrote that article on person of color and labels in general, like Latinx, et cetera, which we see a lot now. Can you expand a little bit?
Sure. I mean, with me, I didn't know that I was labeled a POC until I went to Rhode Island to college for the first time, a university, which I eventually left. I was supposed to go to Brown, but I left because, and I ended up in New York City at Barnard. But one of the reasons was that it was this shock of, wait, why am I going to a separate orientation? Why are you putting me in a person of color orientation? Isn't this segregation? I mean, what is this? I was, and I'm like, I'm sure this is well-intentioned. Like, you think I can't, like, I need to know something, but I'm also American. Like, I was born here and I know the ropes, you know what I mean? But so I was like, what is this? And at the same time, I understand that it's also a matter of like, okay, well, maybe people weren't looking at certain, like Latinx people that were not called that. They were just Latino at the time, and there was not enough entry into universities. And so there was a lot of movements that was happening. And so, there are reasons for it. There's also a reason for the label so that you could speak about it, right? There is a problem with this, and therefore I have to put a name on it. So like, people of color is an easy way to say, let's talk about this group of people that we now have to discuss in many ways. Great. But eventually, the labels start to pick up others, like, LGBTQ is also picking up other letters, right? Like, there's
many other letters.
many letters. And I understand the impulse, but at the same time, it defies the idea that you're making this group, oh wait, but there's other people in the group and they're individual, right? So you're like, okay, yes, because everybody is an individual, right? So it sort of like eats itself up in the end.
Yeah.
And so
And there's no stopping it. It just continues and continues. Same thing happened to me at Georgetown. A young lady told me, "Oh, you've been assigned to the People of Color Committee." And then she was darker than I was. So I was very confused because she wasn't in that committee. So I said, "But you're not in this committee, but you're darker than I am." She goes, "Oh, no, but I'm Italian." Like, okay. So,
that's so interesting.
It just rang so artificial that it was very uncomfortable. And I think that's what ends up happening with labels.
Yeah. And
go ahead.
And it's not that you're not completely relating to many people that are placed in these groups, right? Like, I come from a very mixed family, and so I actually link up with a lot of different kinds of people. It's not that we don't, but we're gonna find that on our own. Like, we're not, we can do it.
Right, exactly. Like, we should get more credit than that in many ways. I wanted to take a few minutes, Vanessa, and also talk a little bit about what's happening in Cuba right now with the movements that are happening on the island that's really not getting covered in English media at all. And kind of have you maybe update the program on what's happening there.
So there's a huge movement called the San Isidro movement on the island of artists that are protesting daily, risking their lives. And there's a lot of arbitrary arrests on the island, which has always happened, but that has incremented recently because people are actually trying to speak out and say, we don't want this system anymore. And that is something very different because people would sort of like hide the freedom of speech or freedom of expression in I want to say this artistically and you're taking it away from me. But actually now they're just saying enough. And for enough to happen, we don't want this system, right? Which is a big leap. And something that happens in the media is that you have journalists that are allowed to be in Cuba, and a lot of the newspapers and magazines and the news that we consume have those journalists that are in Cuba, but they're only allowed to report out certain things, and they're also only allowed access to certain things, and there are a lot of rules with that. So what you're receiving on one level is not the full story. And then those same outlets say, well, but if you're not in Cuba, you can't tell the story. But the thing is that with Cuba, there is a diaspora of people and people that are super interconnected on a one-on-one basis with people actually in the island that live outside the island, and those people are part of the narrative. And they should be allowed to tell part of that story, not all of the story, because what we want ultimately is to get these people in the island to get a direct voice out, right? So everything that we can do to make that happen, to say, here are these people that are the connectors, the bridges, right? Which are essentially us, like we're the people that are bridging this story, and now give them the microphone. The dissidents on the island or the people that are protesting, the artists or whatever it is. How do you get that out when people are still under a repressive regime?
Well, I know it's very frustrating, at least for me, to listen to English media here locally that is not covering it, because I always feel like how is the administration, the party in power, going to be informed if even at a local level we can't inform in English our own neighbors about these important issues to us and to 900,000 other households in the county for whom this is very important. If we can even do this here, what hope is there for the Biden administration to take pause with a re-engagement policy? Right.
I do see that. I see a little bit of hope in these things and want more of this. So like the European Parliament did just verbally say there are human rights abuses in Cuba. Here's what they are. The list is pages long. I went through it the other day and I was like, yes. But the thing about that, and when the United States does it as well from a federal level, what it does is it gives you the ability to say, they have said that this is what this is because it comes from a source that we trust, right? And it's incredibly important to have that support system, that international support system, both in the United States and in Europe and abroad and everywhere, all of in the United Nations, etc., because it allows us to point to it as part of the substance that we're speaking about and that we know, but it gives us proof, it gives us it helps.
What do you think we could do better as a Cuban American community to do exactly what with this, get the word out?
Yeah, I mean, first we have to stop fighting amongst each other because that's what everybody wants. I mean, meaning like that's what that one single story wants, right? What the regime wants more than anything is that Cuban Americans fight amongst themselves. So we have to stop doing that, and in order to do that, the same rules apply. Listen to the dissonance. Don't get up at the Christmas table. You know, like it's hard, right? Around Nochebuena, not to say, okay, let's not talk about politics, right? It's okay to talk about politics. Let's talk about it. I mean, when people tell me, I think one of the biggest things that we have to get out of our heads, and I think this would be the one thing that I would say, is that when people say to me, oh yeah, Cuba, let's talk about Cuba, but let's not get political. That's a political statement. Right. What you're saying is that you are actually allowing yourself to be silenced by the Cuban regime who doesn't want you to talk about politics, or by whatever governance you're considering and doesn't want you to talk about politics. That is a political statement. Why can't you talk about it? Why can't you talk about it? You know?
Yeah. So when I think of this, I think of this huge state-run media propaganda machine in Havana, in Cuba, which has tons of resources, and they use their international connections and community to basically spread whatever narrative they find important. Right. Versus this kind of motley crew of straggling exiles, you know, that aren't agreeing, in part because there's a significant spy network here that is really dedicated to making sure that we don't.
Right.
And how, you know, so how do you figure we can work through some of that?
I mean, on my personal level, it is continue to write and speak about it. And I think that in the ways in which each of us as individuals can do that, write and speak about it, or speak about it and share it, the better we are. Because anytime you see something that's coming out of Cuba, all of those videos, it's like you're parceling together, you're cobbling together the story that the Cubans are trying to tell inside the island, right? They're like, here's a video, listen, here's a video, listen. They're very short, and they take a whole lot of courage to get out. So it's we have to listen to them. We have to listen to them together. We have to put it together. We have to use our brains, you know what I mean? And get the bigger context of the thing. And we have to read. We have to also understand history and where all of this is coming from. And so it takes time, and it's not just like, okay, that's that same old thing, because it's not. It changes every single day and it evolves. To keep up with Cuba is a full-time everything.
Oh no, I'm sure, and thank God that you're really good at it and you stay on top of it. I will tell you, as a Cuban gay man, I've always been very, very frustrated with the issue, because, you know, I get to hear things like, oh, there is no racism in Cuba, or they love American men in Cuba, and you know, there's a very strong sex trade in Cuba from Italy, Spain, the U.S., and that's one of their biggest, you know, GDP contributors. So I think it's very, very frustrating, particularly LGBTQ, because so little of the story is known at all.
Yes.
You know, and to if they only knew that, you know, Fidel Castro during AIDS and HIV had sanatoriums where people were exiled, were pushed into those sanatoriums. They were allowed one day. You know, the Arenas movie Before Night Falls captures that, or that they had forced labor camps for gay people, that, you know, that they were forced to do. And that some of those institutions only closed in the late 90s. And then thereafter, they chose to use it as a way of building their international reputation by having his daughter. I mean, where else do you have a straight woman leading an LGBTQ effort?
Right.
Who then gets invited to lead parades here in the US?
Yeah. That is a perfect example of what Cuba is. It is like, here's the image of what it is, and you have the Mariela Castro and the oh, we're so advanced, so much more advanced than you are, and then you have a march where people are silenced, right? Like you can't actually like go out and like have an LGBTQ march. Wait, what? And you know what you're talking about with the work camps, it's horrifying. It's horrifying that existed. If that existed here, we'd be talking about it, and justly so. Still now, you know what I mean? And that people haven't even scratched the surface of that. The fact that Mein Kampf was one of the books that Castro read and based so much. You can see so much.
And further, by the way, when asked to apologize for all those atrocities, he never has.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think that alone says a great deal.
Yeah.
Says a great deal. Vanessa, our time is up, and I knew it would go by very, very fast.
So fast.
But we're leaving the viewers with a clip from LGBTQ activists in Cuba. It's been subtitled in English, and basically all their stuff was shut down. The thing never aired. It wasn't allowed on social media. A lot of them were harassed, threatened with jail time. I hope people notice the simple message in this video. There should be absolutely nothing in this video that causes that level of offense. I don't know if there are any closing words you'd like to add before we leave the viewers with the video, but you're welcome to.
I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to be here and talk with you, because this is part of everything that we have to keep doing. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for doing it, and see you soon. And thanks to everyone out there. We leave you with the video clip. Have a great week.
Sé lo que quieras hacer, ve a donde quieras ir, di lo que quieras decir, que yo también lo haré.
Vive cada momento, cada instante con sentimiento. Libérate de una vez y con tus alas ve a volar por el viento.
Es mi vida, no es tu vida, y mi vida la vivo como quiero yo. Es mi vida, no es tu vida, y mi vida la vivo como quiero yo.
No me importa lo que hablen, así soy yo y así seguiré, con mis defectos y virtudes. Por mi camino ven y sígueme.
La vida es para divertirse, vívela y no la desperdicies. Pon alegría a tu corazón y sentirás lo mismo que siento yo. No, no. Es mi vida, no es tu vida, y mi vida la vivo como quiero yo. Es mi vida, no es tu vida, y mi vida la vivo como quiero yo. Muestra todo tu valor, tiene la llave de tu corazón. Vive segundo a segundo para que te sientas mejor. Vive la vida como tú digas y muy feliz irás.
Por todos los derechos para todas las personas, por una Cuba inclusiva, diversa, llena de colores.
Es mi vida, no es tu vida, y mi vida la vivo como quiero yo. Oh, 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 oh,
Como quiero yo.
es mi vida,
Por el amor, por el respeto,
es mi vida,
por la paz, es mi vida.
es mi vida, la vivo como quiero yo.